On the 4th of June, 1942, 3 American dive bombers screamed down through broken clouds above the Pacific, their pilots squinting through salt spray windscreens at the impossible targets below. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in tight formation, their flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft and armed ordnance. In precisely 5 minutes, the entire calculus of the Pacific War would invert, and the men who had dismissed every warning, ignored every intelligence report, and silenced every dissenting voice would watch their empire's momentum shatter like porcelain dropped from a great height. 6 months earlier, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had stood on the bridge of the battleship Nagato, reviewing the plan that would become the Midway operation. Around him, junior officers nodded with rehearsed enthusiasm, their faces masks of agreement even as private doubts gnawed at their composure. The plan was breathtaking in its complexity. Multiple task forces converging from different directions, a feint toward the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, simultaneous invasion of Midway Atoll to establish a forward base, and the destruction of whatever remained of the American Pacific Fleet. According to historical accounts documented by naval historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully in their comprehensive study of the battle, the operation involved nearly 200 ships, 600 aircraft, and depended on perfect coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. But complexity bred vulnerability, and vulnerability demanded acknowledgement. Yamamoto himself harbored reservations, having studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington during the 1920s. He understood American industrial capacity, their talent for improvisation, their reluctance to accept defeat. Yet even Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, found himself trapped between his own strategic pessimism and the institutional culture that had elevated him. A culture where expressing doubt equaled displaying weakness, where junior officers learned to read their superiors' preferences and mirror them perfectly. Commander Minoru Genda, the air operations officer whose tactical brilliance had made Pearl Harbor possible, pressed for concentration of force. "Keep the carriers together," he urged. "Maintain flexibility. Expect the unexpected." His concerns were noted, then filed away beneath the weight of institutional confidence. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force, accepted the plan with the fatalism of a man who had learned that questioning orders ended careers. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, perhaps the most aggressive and innovative carrier commander in the fleet, kept his counsel, aware that junior admirals did not lecture their superiors on strategy, regardless of how flawed that strategy might be. The cultural architecture that produced this silence had been built over decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy had emerged from the Meiji Restoration, driven by a hunger to match Western naval powers, importing British advisors and Prussian organizational principles while maintaining the rigid hierarchies of feudal tradition. By 1942, this fusion had created an institution of extraordinary tactical skill and crippling strategic blindness. Officers advanced through demonstrated loyalty and technical competence, not through challenging assumptions or proposing alternatives to established doctrine. The result was a navy that could execute complex operations with precision but could not adapt when those operations encountered unexpected resistance. Intelligence reports suggested American carriers might be near Midway. Radio intercepts indicated unusual activity around Pearl Harbor. But these warnings collided with institutional certainty and shattered against it like waves against a seawall. On the 27th of May, 1942, Admiral Nagumo's carrier striking force departed Hashirajima Anchorage, the same protected waters from which the Pearl Harbor attack force had sailed 6 months earlier. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, represented the most experienced carrier force in the world, their air groups having devastated targets from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, from Darwin to the Indian Ocean. Their crews moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this work so often. It had become routine, loading ordnance, spotting aircraft, conducting the endless maintenance that kept complex machinery functioning in corrosive salt air. Below decks, in ready rooms and wardrooms, aviators reviewed their briefings with the casual confidence of men who had struck repeatedly, without meaningful opposition. They would approach Midway at dawn on the 4th of June, launch a massive strike against the island's defenses, suppress American air power, and prepare the way for invasion forces following behind. American carriers, if they appeared at all, would be detected, located, and destroyed with the same decisive efficiency that had characterized every previous engagement. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and now served as Akagi's air operations officer, had watched this confidence harden into something more dangerous than mere optimism. It had become assumption, the unquestioned foundation upon which all planning rested. In his post-war memoir, translated and analyzed by American naval historians, Fuchida would describe an institutional atmosphere where officers confused tactical success with strategic invincibility, where 6 months of victory had erased the memory of how narrow some of those victories had been, how dependent on surprise and enemy unpreparedness. The warning signs were everywhere for those trained to see them. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, American carriers had fought Nagumo's forces to a tactical draw, demonstrating improved coordination and fighting spirit. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, but they had also sunk the light carrier Shoho and damaged Shokaku badly enough to keep her from participating in the Midway operation. More significantly, they had stopped the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby, the first time a Japanese offensive had been turned back since the war began. But Coral Sea's implications were read through the distorting lens of institutional prejudice. Japanese casualties were minimized in reports climbing the chain of command. American tactical improvements were attributed to luck rather than learning. The battle was classified as a victory because the Americans had retreated and lost more tonnage, even though the strategic objective, isolating Australia, had been thwarted. This selective interpretation reflected a deeper pathology. The Imperial Japanese Navy had developed elaborate procedures for reporting success and almost none for analyzing failure. Commander Yasumi Doi, an intelligence officer in Yamamoto's Combined Fleet Headquarters, had compiled a disturbing analysis of American carrier operations based on radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports. The pattern suggested at least 2, possibly 3 American carriers were operating in the Central Pacific. Their movements coordinated in ways that indicated they possessed better intelligence than Japanese planners had assumed. Doi's report circulated among staff officers, generated discussion, and then disappeared into the administrative machinery, emerging in a diluted form that minimized its implications and preserved operational assumptions intact. This institutional processing of inconvenient information followed established patterns. Junior officers learned quickly that reports contradicting the preferences of senior officers were edited, delayed, or simply ignored. The messenger who brought bad news found his career trajectory flattening, his assignments becoming less prestigious, his counsel sought less frequently. The system rewarded certainty and punished doubt, creating a feedback loop where officers competed to demonstrate confidence in plans they privately questioned, each unwilling to be the first to acknowledge what many suspected: that Midway was a gamble disguised as a sure thing. On the 20th of May, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese naval messages, frequency analysis charts, and the accumulated decryption work of months of patient effort. His unit, known as Station Hypo, had been tracking Japanese carrier movements since January, gradually breaking the naval code designated JN-25, building a picture of enemy intentions one fragment at a time. Now that picture had resolved into something both terrifying and opportune, a massive Japanese operation aimed at Midway Atoll scheduled for early June. The intelligence breakthrough had required detective work that combined cryptanalysis with psychological insight. Japanese messages referred repeatedly to target AF without specifying what AF represented. Rochefort's team had suspected Midway, but suspicion required confirmation. Working with Midway's commanders, they arranged for the atoll to broadcast an uncoded message reporting problems with their fresh water distillation system. Within days, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was experiencing water supply difficulties. The trap had confirmed what Rochefort's instinct had suggested. Midway was the target, and the attack would come in early June. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, had absorbed this intelligence with the careful attention of a man who understood that wars turned on information as much as firepower. Unlike his counterparts in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Nimitz had built a command structure that encouraged dissenting views, rewarded accurate reporting regardless of whether it contained good news, and maintained clear channels between intelligence analysts and operational commanders. When Rochefort told him Japanese carriers would appear northwest of Midway on the 4th of June, Nimitz believed him and began positioning his forces accordingly. This willingness to trust intelligence, even intelligence that predicted enemy actions contradicting conventional assumptions, reflected cultural and institutional differences that extended beyond mere command style. The American Navy had emerged from different traditions than its Japanese counterpart, traditions emphasizing practical results over formal hierarchy, rewarding innovation over obedience, and maintaining lateral communication between departments that Japanese organizations kept rigidly separated. These differences had been masked during the initial Japanese onslaught, when surprise and superior training had overwhelmed American forces unprepared for war. But 6 months into the conflict, American organizational advantages were beginning to manifest. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence was producing warnings that their institutional structure was designed to ignore. Radio traffic analysis by Japanese naval intelligence units indicated unusual American carrier activity around Pearl Harbor. Reconnaissance flights, when they could penetrate the operational area, reported American ships in locations that suggested forward deployment. Most critically, a planned reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor by long-range seaplanes operating from French frigate shoals had been canceled when American ships were discovered already occupying the refueling point. This meant Japanese planners would approach Midway blind to American carrier positions, relying on assumptions rather than confirmed intelligence. Commander Doi, the intelligence officer who had compiled the concerning analysis, watched these warning signs accumulate with growing anxiety. He approached his immediate superior, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior operations officer, with a carefully phrased suggestion that perhaps American carrier strength was being underestimated, that perhaps the assumption of surprise should be questioned. Kuroshima listened with the polite attention that Japanese hierarchical culture demanded, thanked Doi for his diligence, and then explained that operational plans had been finalized and forces were already deploying. To modify the operation now would signal lack of confidence, confuse commanders at sea, and undermine morale throughout the fleet. What Kuroshima did not say, but what Doi understood perfectly, was that questioning the plan meant questioning Yamamoto, whose prestige had grown enormous after Pearl Harbor. It meant implying that Japan's greatest naval strategist had made errors in judgment. In an institution where loyalty to superiors represented the highest virtue, such implications were unthinkable. So Doi returned to his desk, filed his reports, and watched the fleet sail toward an enemy that was expecting them. On the 4th of June, 1942, at 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo stood in Akagi's flag bridge as his carriers turned into the wind to launch the Midway strike. Around him, staff officers moved through pre-launch routines with mechanical precision, their voices calm as they coordinated the launch of over 100 aircraft into pre-dawn darkness. Below, flight deck crews manhandled dive bombers and fighters into launch position, their movements choreographed by months of practice. Their efficiency a testament to Japanese naval aviation's technical sophistication. But beneath this surface efficiency, tensions that had been accumulating since planning began now crystallized into immediate tactical dilemmas. Nagumo faced a problem that no amount of training could resolve. He was executing a plan that assumed conditions contradicting the intelligence fragments reaching him. The operation required him to attack Midway with sufficient strength to suppress its defenses, maintain a reserve force to deal with American carriers if they appeared, and coordinate with invasion forces approaching from different directions, all while operating within range of American land-based aircraft from Midway itself. The doctrine that governed Japanese carrier operations had been developed from theoretical studies and limited combat experience. It emphasized decisive battle, concentration of force, and the importance of striking first with overwhelming power. But it had been refined during exercises where enemy movements were predictable and intelligence was complete. Now Nagumo found himself executing these procedures while knowing that American carriers might be nearby, that his reconnaissance assets were limited, and that the complex multi-pronged approach mandated by the overall plan prevented him from maintaining the concentrated force that doctrine recommended. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the Midway strike force into the darkness, 108 aircraft navigating by dead reckoning toward an island they would reach at dawn. Behind them, Nagumo retained 93 aircraft as a reserve, fighters to defend the carriers, dive bombers and torpedo bombers armed for attacking ships. This reserve represented Nagumo's hedge against uncertainty, his acknowledgement that American carriers might be operating somewhere in the vast ocean surrounding him. But maintaining this reserve created a different vulnerability. His first wave might be insufficient to completely suppress Midway's defenses, requiring a second strike that would commit his reserve to land attack rather than keeping it available for anti-ship operations. At 6:30 in the morning, Tominaga's first wave struck Midway. The attack was professional, determined, and ultimately incomplete. American fighters rose to meet the Japanese bombers, suffering devastating losses, but forcing the attackers to fight through defensive fire. Anti-aircraft batteries on the island, manned by Marines who had been warned the attack was coming, put up concentrated fire that damaged several Japanese aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes cratered runways, destroyed buildings, and inflicted casualties, but failed to completely suppress Midway's ability to launch counterstrikes. At 7 o'clock, Tominaga radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." 5 words that transformed a tactical decision into a strategic inflection point. Nagumo faced the choice that would define his place in history: commit his reserve to a second Midway strike, or hold it back for the American carriers that intelligence suggested might be nearby. The decision should have been straightforward. Doctrine emphasized the primacy of destroying enemy carriers. Every tactical principle Nagumo had learned emphasized the importance of maintaining flexibility and keeping forces available to respond to unexpected threats. But doctrine collided with immediate pressures and institutional expectations. The invasion force was approaching Midway on a fixed schedule. Ground commanders expected air support. The overall plan required Midway's neutralization before the invasion fleet arrived. To refuse a second strike meant accepting failure of the invasion, explaining to Yamamoto why the operation had been aborted, accounting for the decision to subordinates who would question his judgment. At 7:15, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed for a second strike against Midway. Ordnance crews swarmed over the dive bombers and torpedo planes, removing armor-piercing bombs and anti-ship torpedoes, replacing them with general-purpose bombs for land targets. The work proceeded with practiced efficiency, but it created a window of vulnerability that would prove catastrophic. Because at 7:28, even as ordnance crews worked frantically on the hangar decks, a float plane from the cruiser Tone reported sighting American ships to the northeast. The scout had been delayed in launching, putting it behind schedule in its search pattern. Now it transmitted the message that changed everything: enemy surface ships detected, but their composition was unclear. On the morning of the 4th of June, 1942 at 7:35, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen in a moment that would be dissected by historians for generations. 7 minutes earlier, the delayed scout plane from Tone had reported American ships to the northeast. Now Nagumo demanded clarification. What types of ships? Were carriers present? The question hung in the air while ordnance crews continued swapping weapons on his reserve aircraft, each minute bringing them closer to the point where the rearming process would be irreversible. The scout pilot's response came at 7:50. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers mentioned. Nagumo felt the tension ease slightly. Cruisers and destroyers represented a threat, but not the decisive threat that enemy carriers would pose. His staff officers exchanged glances of relief. Perhaps the intelligence warnings had been exaggerated. Perhaps the Americans had sent only a surface force to defend Midway. But at 8:09, even as this fragile certainty was settling into place, the scout sent an amplifying report. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. 4 words that detonated like bombs on Akagi's bridge. The uncertainty that Nagumo had tried to eliminate through decision now returned with compounded urgency. American carriers were present. The fundamental assumption underlying his decision to rearm for a second Midway strike was wrong. Everything had to change. Except changing was no longer simple. His reserve aircraft were halfway through rearming. Some still carried armor-piercing bombs. Others had been fitted with general-purpose bombs for land attack. Ordnance that had been removed sat on carts clogging the hangar decks. To reverse the process and rearm again for anti-ship attack would require at least an hour, perhaps longer. Meanwhile, his first wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel, some damaged, all requiring immediate landing. The flight decks would have to be cleared to recover them, preventing any possibility of launching an immediate strike against the American carriers. Commander Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, lay in his bunk burning with fever, too ill to be on the bridge but monitoring the radio reports from his cabin. Even in his diminished state, he recognized the cascading failure unfolding. The decision to rearm had been premature, made before all information was available. Now that decision had created a tactical situation where every option was bad, and time was working against them with accelerating momentum. At 10:54, Yamaguchi launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, everything he could put in the air quickly, toward the American carriers. At 12:45, he launched a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. Both strikes found Yorktown, damaged her severely, and proved that even against overwhelming odds, properly executed carrier strikes could achieve tactical success. But they also proved that tactical success without strategic advantage was insufficient. Yamaguchi had hurt one American carrier while losing 3 of his own. The mathematics of attrition had turned decisively against Japan. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu. The pattern that had destroyed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu repeated itself on Hiryu's decks. Bombs striking among fueled aircraft, fuel fires overwhelming damage control efforts, secondary explosions spreading destruction faster than human effort could contain. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or abandoned, their hulls torn open by explosions, their decks littered with bodies and wreckage, their crews swimming in oil-slicked water or huddled in lifeboats watching their ships die. The battle would continue through the next day as Japanese and American forces maneuvered for position, as American aircraft hunted damaged Japanese ships, as both sides tried to determine what remained of their opponent's strength. But the decisive moment had already passed. In 5 minutes on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, the momentum of Japanese expansion had been broken. On the evening of the 5th of June, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto stood in the operations room of his flagship, the super battleship Yamato, and confronted the reports that systematically dismantled every assumption underlying the Midway operation. 4 carriers sunk. Hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew dead. The invasion force recalled. The American carriers damaged but operational. The strategic initiative in the Pacific reversed in a single day of combat. Around him, staff officers worked with the mechanical efficiency of men processing information, too devastating to fully absorb. Loss reports were compiled, unit positions plotted, fuel states calculated. The machinery of command continued functioning, even as the enterprise it was designed to serve collapsed. Yamamoto himself maintained the external composure that Japanese military culture demanded, his face revealing nothing of the thoughts that must have been churning through a mind that had predicted exactly this outcome, if Japan fought America without achieving quick victory. He had opposed war with America, arguing that Japan could fight successfully for 6 months, perhaps a year, but could not win a protracted conflict against American industrial capacity. He had been overruled by political forces convinced that Western powers would negotiate rather than fight. Then, ordered to fight, he had crafted the Pearl Harbor attack as a desperate gamble to cripple American naval power before it could be brought to bear. Now, 6 months into the war, he had predicted would end in Japanese defeat. The mathematics of attrition were beginning to manifest exactly as he had feared. The fundamental problem wasn't tactical. His carriers had been superbly handled up until the moment they were destroyed. His aircrew were among the best trained in the world. His ships were generally superior to their American counterparts in individual capabilities. The problem was strategic and systemic. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses at the rate America could produce new ships and aircraft. More critically, Japan lacked the training infrastructure to replace experienced aircrew. The pilots who had died at Midway represented years of training, hundreds of hours of flight time, combat experience that couldn't be replicated in accelerated training programs. But beyond these material factors lay something more subtle and more dangerous: the cultural and institutional factors that had prevented the warnings from being heard, the alternatives from being considered, the doubts from being expressed. Yamamoto himself bore responsibility for creating an environment where junior officers learned that questioning plans meant questioning loyalty. His prestige after Pearl Harbor had become so great that suggesting his strategy might be flawed became tantamount to suggesting the emperor himself might err. Commander Doi, the intelligence officer whose warnings had been ignored, sat at his desk compiling the after-action reports that would be distributed to surviving commanders. He knew that his analysis of American carrier strength had been correct, that his warnings about intelligence gaps had been accurate, that his suggestions for alternative approaches had been sound. He also knew that writing those facts into the official record would end his career. The system that had ignored his warnings before the battle would not tolerate his vindication after the defeat, so the official reports would reflect the consensus that was already forming among senior officers, that Midway had been lost through unfortunate timing, through bad luck in reconnaissance, through factors beyond human control. The decision to rearm aircraft would be described as tactically sound given information available at the time. The failure to detect American carriers earlier would be attributed to weather and chance, rather than systematic intelligence failures. The loss of 4 carriers would be presented as a tactical defeat, rather than evidence of deeper institutional problems. This consensus reflected more than mere scapegoating or blame avoidance. It reflected genuine inability to see the systemic factors that had produced the defeat. Officers who had been trained to value loyalty over accuracy, who had risen through a system that rewarded conformity and punished dissent, who had internalized the belief that institutional cohesion mattered more than individual judgment. These men literally could not recognize how their own institutional culture had created the conditions for disaster. Over the following months and years, the pattern would repeat itself with variations. At Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders would continue to underestimate American strength and overestimate their own advantages. In the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier forces would be destroyed by American air groups that had been trained with the industrial abundance that Yamamoto had feared. At Leyte Gulf, Japanese admirals would devise complex plans requiring perfect coordination, then watch those plans collapse when confronted with American flexibility and tactical innovation. The institutional culture that produced these failures was not unique to Japan's military. Every large organization develops internal dynamics that can privilege institutional preservation over mission effectiveness, that can confuse loyalty with agreement, that can mistake confidence for competence. What made the Japanese example particularly dramatic was the speed with which technological warfare revealed these institutional pathologies. In the age of carrier aviation, where battles could be decided in minutes and errors compounded exponentially, institutional inability to acknowledge doubt became operationally catastrophic. For individual officers caught in this system, the psychological burden was immense. Men like Commander Genda, who had designed brilliant tactical operations while doubting the strategic framework within which they operated, faced the knowledge that their skills had been deployed in service of a doomed enterprise. They had done everything their training demanded, executed every procedure perfectly, and still failed because the system within which they operated was incapable of adaptation. On the 15th of August, 1945, more than 3 years after the Battle of Midway, Emperor Hirohito broadcast to the Japanese nation that the war had ended in defeat. The voice that most Japanese subjects had never heard before explained in formal court language that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that Japan would endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. Between Midway and that August morning lay 3 years of grinding attrition: carrier battles in the Solomon Islands, amphibious assaults across the Pacific, submarine warfare that strangled Japan's economy, and finally, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that provided the final argument for surrender. But historians examining those 3 years would trace a direct line back to the 5 minutes on the 4th of June, 1942, when 3 carriers burned and Japan's strategic offensive capability died with them. The institutional culture that had failed at Midway continued operating throughout the war, producing disasters that followed the same pattern: complex plans that assumed perfect conditions, intelligence warnings that were dismissed, dissenting voices that were silenced, and tactical skill that couldn't compensate for strategic blindness. Commanders who learned from defeats were rotated to less important positions, while officers who maintained aggressive optimism regardless of circumstances continued to receive prestigious commands. The system selected for the traits that had produced failure at Midway and replicated them at larger scale throughout the remaining war years. Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara during the battle, continued serving in various commands through the war years, despite presiding over the greatest carrier defeat in naval history. He was eventually assigned to command naval forces defending Saipan, where American amphibious assault overwhelmed Japanese defenses in July 1944. Rather than surrender, Nagumo committed suicide on the 6th of July, following the path that Japanese military culture prescribed for commanders who had failed their duty. His death removed from the historical record the personal testimony of what he had been thinking during those critical hours at Midway, leaving only the official reports that had been sanitized to protect institutional reputation. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander who had urged immediate attack and whose carrier Hiryu had fought alone after the other 3 carriers were destroyed, went down with his ship on the 5th of June, 1942. His death was mourned throughout the fleet as the loss of one of Japan's most promising naval officers. But his final battle had demonstrated the impossibility of individual brilliance compensating for systemic failure. Even his tactical skill and aggressive instincts couldn't overcome the strategic situation that institutional culture had created. Commander Genda survived the war, his reputation as an air tactician surviving even the disasters he had witnessed. In post-war interviews with American naval historians, he provided detailed technical accounts of Japanese carrier operations while carefully avoiding criticism of the institutional culture that had shaped those operations. Whether this reticence reflected genuine inability to see systemic factors or calculated protection of surviving colleagues remained ambiguous. Either way, his testimony reinforced the pattern of analyzing tactical details while avoiding uncomfortable questions about institutional dysfunction. Commander Doi, the intelligence officer whose warnings had been ignored, also survived the war. He spent the post-war years in quiet retirement, his contributions to intelligence analysis unrecognized, his accurate warnings about American carrier strength unacknowledged in official histories. His story exemplified thousands of junior officers who had seen problems clearly, but had learned that speaking truth to power ended careers rather than correcting errors. The system had trained them to remain silent, and they had obeyed that training even when silence contributed to disaster. The American officers who had won at Midway faced different post-battle trajectories that reflected different institutional cultures. Admiral Nimitz, who had trusted Rochefort's intelligence despite its contradicting conventional assumptions, went on to command Pacific operations through the war's end, consistently demonstrating the flexibility and willingness to empower subordinates that characterized effective American naval leadership. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, whose tactical decision to continue searching had found the Japanese carriers, was decorated for his initiative and promoted, the system rewarding exactly the kind of independent judgment that Japanese culture suppressed. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, whose code-breaking had provided the intelligence that made victory possible, faced his own institutional politics that demonstrated American organizations weren't immune to the pathologies that had crippled Japanese effectiveness. Rivals in the Navy's intelligence bureaucracy, resentful of his success and uncomfortable with his unconventional methods, ensured he received no medal for his contribution to the battle and engineered his transfer away from code-breaking work. The difference was that American institutional culture, while capable of similar pettiness, maintained enough flexibility that Rochefort's contribution was eventually recognized, and his techniques were propagated throughout the intelligence community despite bureaucratic resistance. The broader lesson that emerged from Midway extended far beyond naval tactics or even military culture. It revealed how institutional structures shape perception, how hierarchies filter information, how cultures of certainty suppress the doubt necessary for adaptation. These lessons remained relevant long after carrier aviation ceased being the dominant form of naval warfare, long after the specific technologies and tactics of 1942 became obsolete. Organizations that punish doubt and reward certainty create environments where errors compound rather than correct. When institutional culture makes questioning plans equivalent to questioning loyalty, the resulting conformity produces strategic blindness, regardless of how much tactical skill individual members possess. When hierarchies are so rigid that information can only flow upward in forms that preserve superior officers' preferences, the organization becomes incapable of learning from its environment until catastrophic failure forces change. The Japanese admirals who dismissed doubt before Midway weren't stupid or incompetent. They were products of a system that had selected and promoted them precisely because they embodied the traits that system valued: loyalty, confidence, technical excellence within defined parameters, and willingness to execute complex plans without questioning underlying assumptions. The system had worked brilliantly for 6 months, producing an unbroken string of victories that had validated the cultural values producing them. Then, in 5 minutes, technological warfare revealed what had been obscured by initial success: that the cultural values producing tactical victories were simultaneously creating strategic vulnerabilities. The cost was measured in burning carriers on the morning of the 4th of June, in thousands of Japanese sailors swimming in the Pacific while their ships sank beneath them, in the strategic initiative that passed to America and never returned. But it was also measured in opportunities not taken, in warnings not heard, in alternatives not considered, in the accumulated weight of all the doubts that institutional culture had suppressed in the name of cohesion and loyalty. 3 years after Midway, as Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios throughout Japan announcing surrender, the ultimate cost became clear. The admirals had denied doubt, convinced that confidence and will could overcome material disadvantages. They had created an institutional culture where questioning became betrayal, where expressing uncertainty became weakness, where the appearance of consensus mattered more than accurate assessment of reality. Midway had shown them the cost of that certainty: 4 carriers burned in 5 minutes. But the lesson had come too late, delivered by a system incapable of learning from failure, because it couldn't acknowledge failure without undermining the cultural foundations that gave it meaning. The battle's legacy extended into the post-war world, studied at naval academies and business schools, analyzed by historians and organizational theorists, cited as warning and example. Its lessons appeared whenever large organizations faced rapid change requiring institutional adaptation: that loyalty divorced from accuracy becomes liability, that confidence unsupported by realistic assessment becomes delusion, that institutional cultures rewarding certainty over doubt create their own disasters regardless of how much talent and dedication individual members possess. On the 4th of June, 1942, 3 American dive bombers screamed down through broken clouds and changed history. But the real story wasn't just about those 5 minutes of combat. It was about all the moments before: the warnings dismissed, the doubts suppressed, the alternatives not considered. It was about an institutional culture that valued cohesion over truth, appearance over substance, loyalty over accuracy, and it was about the price that culture paid when technological warfare compressed the consequences of systemic failure into 5 minutes of fire and explosion above the Pacific. The admirals had denied doubt, and Midway showed them the cost. The lesson remained, written in the wrecks of 4 carriers at the bottom of the Pacific, waiting for every generation that would need to learn it again.